Hello, beautiful people, and a warm welcome back to the Surrey Art School studio as we prepare to embark on cycle 4 of our winter season theme, A Winter's Tale. Now, the last couple of cycles we've been looking at the deer and really exploring that story of the deer mother, thinking about how the deer mother might look in our mind's eye, and I really wanted to bring the focus into landscapes for this particular cycle, and thinking about the lands that the deer might roam, essentially. So I was thinking about the reindeer and Lapland, and thinking about their kind of landscapes and what they would look like and feel like to be in, and that has been the main focus for this cycle today. So we begin by looking at how we might make mountains, and thinking about sort of the background of a wild winter landscape that you might find somewhere like Lapland. And then I offer up some little tips, some ideas and suggestions on how to include some trees in your landscape. And then finally, at the end of the cycle, I sort of bring things together into a little winter landscape / composition, which includes a couple of deer too. So I hope you enjoy the little suggestions that I've offered up during this cycle. It's a bit of a challenge to look at such a broad topic such as landscapes in such a short space of time. But I hope that the little offerings that I have included during this cycle might be a springboard to some ideas of your own. And of course, I welcome your own thoughts and interpretation. And as always, have a look at the resources, because I have made so many samples for this winter landscape in my exploration, sort of figuring out what the best or most useful techniques might be for you today. So do have a look at the resources for that. So yeah, enjoy this little cycle on landscapes. I look forward to seeing what you do with it, and I will meet you back here for cycle 5 coming up very soon. So much love and so much encouragement with the continuing journey that you're on. Okay, my loves, let's make some mountains. And mountains are said to be the bones of the earth, and it may be that our dear mother is sort of roaming at the base of the mountains, or maybe she's flying away above them. We can decide on that at a later point, but I just wanted to share a couple of techniques. Now, there are many, 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 many ways to make a mountain, but one of the things that I've learnt through the process of doing this is to make sure that your mountains are quite uneven, that they don't look like pyramids, essentially. So I'm looking at a few images of mountains as inspiration. These are on the resources for you. And it's sort of about getting those uneven peaks, really. And I just want to remind you as well that we're not going for something photorealistic here. We're going for an impression of a mountain, something that's it's still sort of an imaginary landscape. So just let yourselves off the hook if you're feeling the pressure to make a really photorealistic mountain here. This is not what this is about. So I've just got my size 6 brush, a couple of pots of water. I've got some paper towel to one side, and for this first one I'm just going to work with the colours in my pan palette. So I've got a black here, but it's a fairly brownish black. So I'm just going to add some water to that just to get it going first. And I do have a little bit of brown to one side here. I'm going to sort of mix the two up when I start working on it, but I just want to get them going first. So I'm just going to add some water, get a sort of decent mix in the pan at least. There we go, and then clean my brush. So for this first one, I'm just going to put down a water mask. So brush is clean, get rid of the excess, and then get some clean water. And we're just going to start to map out the sort of peak, the core shapes of the top of that sort of mountain line that what I can see in the image anyway. And I'm going to sort of follow the contours of the mountain with where I put my water here. So I don't want paint absolutely everywhere here, and it can be really easy to get carried away with adding a little bit too much paint. What we want is a little bit of the white of the page showing through for this mountain. So I've left little gaps, as you can see, just to try and preserve some of that white of the page. And this one is a fairly sort of pointy mountain, but it's still not a pyramid. Let's be clear. Okay, so once I've done that, I'm going to pick up some of this black and a bit of this brown, and I'm going to just start to drop it in And just let it move and flow and go where it wants to go. Now you might want to get rid of some of the excess water off your brush when you do this. And what we're doing here is we're creating like a sort of texture. It's a sort of texture study, I suppose. And just allowing that paint to sort of shift and move as it wants to. And just sort of loosely preserving those white spaces. So I'm just popping all the paint in first. Just a mixture of this black and brown. It granulates and you get some really nice textures from that. And maybe getting a little bit darker at the base of the mountain. Lovely. Just want to get some paint down to begin with. Right, clean the brush. Right, now I'm going to soften a little bit and just blend the paint into some of those lighter areas. So just keep cleaning your brush, adding water, sorry, and allowing those areas to soften and sort of blend off. And just that mixture of black and brown. A very earthy mountain, this one, from what I can see. Okay, so that's quite nice actually. It's built up some nice textures. We've got some dark areas, maybe areas of sort of forest. Not sure. But can you see there's sort of texture and there are areas of light and there are areas of dark. And that's what we're sort of aiming for here, is just to create a sort of very textured ground. And maybe other colours could go in there if you wanted to as well. If you want to put a little bit of green in there, that's up to you. So that's it. I'm just going to clean my brush now. Take off all the excess. And what I want to do is sort of add in by taking away, if that makes sense. So I'm looking at some of the sort of chasmy sort of cracks in the mountain, I suppose. And I'm just starting to lift out some areas of paint. Just using my dry brush. So just the brush, lifting that paint back off and starting to create some facets in the mountain. Now you don't want to take this away everywhere. But what we want is some sort of cracks and shapes appearing in this mountain so it looks a little bit less flat. Can you see how that's sort of starting to work already? So my brush is sort of a little bit sort of almondy shape, so I've just got to be a bit careful here that when I'm taking out these areas, I'm not ending up with too softer marks. I want sort of nice, sort of hard cracks appearing in my mountain. So just keep pulling away little areas. Of course, you don't want to do this everywhere, but just starting to get a sense of the texture of that mountain. So the texture of some of those crevices that pick up the light. And I'm just working my way down the side of the mountain now. Just pulling out some of those textures. So sort of working in reverse here. Taking away rather than adding. And you could do this with a paper towel as well, but with a brush it's just that little bit more controlled. So I sort of came across this by accident yesterday where I was going just a little bit too heavy with my paint, or I'd gone a little bit too heavy with my paint, and I thought, well, what can I do? I can definitely start to lift out. Then if you've got areas that are particularly light in the mountain, then pull away that paint too, so you're leaving almost just like a little stain. And actually just this top area of my mountain just needs a little bit more paint. It's a little bit too pale. So I'm just going to put a little bit more paint in. So it's a sort of push and pull, this one. You can sort of darken around the edges that you've lifted out from. And sort of just adding and taking away and stepping back and having a look. Seeing how that's sort of coming together. And we're sort of getting there now. Just adding a few more little facets to this side of the mountain. And so just a very simple textured mountainside with working with the paint wet on wet to get some lovely granulation, and then pulling away just to create this sense of the facets of the mountain, these sort of rocky areas that are sticking out, and these sort of areas of light and dark, especially as we get towards that peak. So have a little play with this technique, adding in, taking away a little bit. And as I said, if you want a more extreme texture, that's sort of starting to build up quite well. I'm working quite intuitively with it. If you want a real extreme texture, like maybe here down at the bottom, you could actually just do a little bit of lifting out with your paper towel as well. And I'm just going to pop just behind that mountain. Just going to pop a really sort of watered down sister mountain sort of sitting behind as well, just whilst I'm here. But that can be really, really light, really, really loose, just a sort of echo that I can see in the image that's sort of sitting behind. And that doesn't have to be absolutely perfectly finished, executed, okay? So just play around with that sort of push and pull technique, seeing if you can create that sense of the light and the shadow in the mountain, that sense of those areas that where the light is catching on some of those harder ridges that have sort of erupted from under the surface of the ground. There we go. So yeah, one to play with, don't over fiddle it, just sort of keep working with it and then step back, and if it's feeling like a little bit too light, you can add more paint and just sort of see how you go with that process, but just sort of adding and then taking away, and just that push and pull between the two to create a sort of more abstract mountainscape. Okay, so I'm just going to reset, and then we're going to do a slightly different type of mountain. As I said, there are many ways to do a mountain, and I've made many samples, so I will include all of those in the resources for you to have a look at. I just want to have a go at one more little style, just to sort of feed into your landscape vocabulary for this cycle. Okay, so for the second mountain, I'm going to use my Payne's Blue Grey, which is the little sample that you've got in your subscription boxes. So you can use this or any other cool tone that you've got. So if you've just got a Payne's Grey in your pan palette, like this one here, then just use that, okay? But I'm just going to use this one because I can, because I've got it. And I rather like the tone of it. I'm looking at this sort of more bluish mountainscape and thinking about how we can create a little response to that for this particular experiment. So I really want to get my paint going first. I've got it on the palette, this one. Get it going to begin with. And we're going to sort of grow this mountain from the center. So I'm going to begin by just putting in a sort of craggly line for that top, that first little bit of the mountain. And then from there, I'm going to start to add paint. But the trick is here, it's really easy to add too much paint. So what we really want is to honour all that white that we can see from the very top of the mountain. Honour the white, try and leave more white than blue, if that makes sense. So I'm just starting to pull away, looking at some of those shadowy spaces. And starting to create some of those sort of areas where the snow pokes through. So there's lots of snow at the top of the mountain, so we're going to keep things quite light at the top of the mountain. And gradually, as we pull down, we allow more of these little facets or faces of the mountain to start to appear. So you can start from that edge each time, but just making sure we leave lots of gaps, keeping our brushwork nice and loose here as that mountain starts to appear. There's just something about the strength of the mountain and sort of that idea of working with the bones of the mother, that made me feel like mountains needed to be part of our story, or hills at the very least. And I suppose you could do that one there, that hillside, with like green and make it more of a Scottish mountain. I'm really thinking in the sort of wild, imaginary winter landscapes here with the little ideas that I'm offering up. So this is all I'm doing here is sort of adding little bits of paint, pulling sideways to start to create some of those facets in the mountain. We want sort of pointy shapes, nice and loose. And it might take a little bit of practice, this. Your first mountain may not be your finest mountain, and that is okay. Just have a practice and a play with this technique until you sort of get to grips with it. So a little bit more complicated, a bit less beginner friendly, this way of making a mountain, but very, very satisfying to do. And all I'm doing is looking at where I'm seeing bits of mountain sticking out from the snow, adding in some little bits, some sort of chunks of dark, I suppose, but the majority of the mountain is quite light until we get down to the base, and then we end up with some sort of bigger areas of forest and some bigger areas of woodland. Always, it's a little bit less cold at the base of the mountain, so we get a little bit more of the mountain poking through. But for some reason, just this sort of working from right to left, pulling across, and sort of trying to get a sense of some of those textures that we see when... So it's quite hard to talk and do it, actually. Textures that we see when the mountain pokes through those areas of snow. This is what we're sort of aiming for here. So a nice craggy, white, cool-toned mountain. Just using nice loose brushwork and sort of quite pointy shapes, I suppose, to build up this sense of the mountainside. And you can keep adding to this. You could add another little one sort of sitting behind here, I can see. And maybe this one again is like a little bit less detailed, a little bit like the one that we did sitting in the background in the top right. Just playing and feeling our way into these sort of wintry landscape elements for this cycle. But yeah, there is no right or wrong way to do a mountain. There are many, many ways to make it the mountain. There's sort of a block of much flatter area here, so I can pop that into. So just responding to the image, responding to the sort of light and dark areas in that image, sort of almost like a tonal study, really, of a little mountain range, and at the same time sort of soaking up that strength, that grounded energy of the mountain as we work. Okay, so a couple of ideas with mountains, something for you to have a little play with, perhaps something we'll incorporate or pull together at the end of this cycle if we have time. If not, we'll come back to these landscape elements as we get towards the end of the season and see if we can come up with a sort of land for our dear mother to inhabit. Okay, so just very quickly before I move on from this, I was just thinking about skies, and we will look more at skies in the next cycle. We're going to look at what we can put in the world above our dear mother. But just a little idea for skies, if you wanted to add a little bit more of a sky above your mountain. Just thinking about wetting down the area above your mountain. Be careful not to touch the mountain, by the way. This is just a little fun idea, optional. So just wetting down that area, grabbing a little bit of your Payne's Blue-Grey or whatever you've been working with, and just dropping it in, adding a few clouds, a sort of cold winter sky above. And then just for a little bit of fun, we go into the yellow on our pan palette. And we just drop that in to the centre. Just press, 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 press. we get a nice, cool winter sun. So just allowing it to soften off like it does in the winter. We get little glimmers of it, don't we? And a lot of cloud around. And just the more you press in the centre, the wider your sun in the sky is going to be. But I just thought it'd be nice to connect in with those suns that we were doing in the last cycle. And thinking about adding a little bit of winter sun and maybe some little rays of that coming down below as well. Just a little bit of warmth to our cold winter landscape on a cold winter's day. So again, just fun, just optional, invitation to play, add a little sunshine above your mountain. And there are some other suggestions for adding a bit of shine behind your mountain on the resources, okay? Okay, so I wanted to make some suggestions on trees that you might like to, or some different ways of doing trees that you might like to explore when you're putting together this sort of wintry land for the dear mother. So the one that most springs to mind to me is like a fir tree, and or sort of Christmas tree, and there are a few different ways that you can sort of go about those. Sort of fir, pine, spruce, they're all in that same kind of category. So I was going to start with just some sort of mid-ground trees, if you like. And I'm just using that Payne's Blue Grey again, just so we can explore the shapes and colours. And maybe we'll end up working with different colours later on in the season. But for now, just to get a sense of the sort of silhouette of these trees, or the sort of the shapes, the bare bones of these trees, I suppose, I'm just going to work with one colour. So for a little sort of mid-ground, sort of Christmassy tree, I'm going to just put in a trunk first, and then I'm going to start just with like little marks, pulling out, leaving gaps, making sure you leave gaps to allow some of that white of the page to come through here. And just sort of pulling side to side from that trunk and sort of gradually building up that little shape of a little fir tree. So there are lots of different ways, again, that you can do trees. I'm going to add a little bit of water to the base of this. It just helps to sort of ground it into the landscape as well. And maybe my trunk was a little bit too thick, but we can work with that. So you could do the same again, but this time just using slightly different brush strokes. So for this one, I'm just going to use the tip of my brush and tickle it and just keep that sense of looseness just by tickling the page. And again, just leaving lots of space, allowing that white of the page to come through. And then again, we can ground that with a little bit of water, so these nice cool wintry tones. And then some of the trees that we see are actually quite tall and slightly different shapes. So let's add another one in, a little bit taller this time. And for this one, I'm just going to keep my marks a little bit shorter, little gaps in between, and do something just a little bit more spindly. So again, we're just dibbling the paint on. I'm not going so wide with this one. Sort of being inspired by some of the trees on the mountain images that I've provided for you. And this is a really nice place to start. It's just with like, it's just with one colour, so that you can get a sense of the shape. Sorry, my microphone just fell off. So yeah, just keeping it, that's fairly, you don't want to be too uniform with trees. This is what I've learned. You want to keep them actually quite light and loose. So this one a little bit different, leaving a little bit more of a gap. A nice little fir tree. And again, we'll ground that off with a little bit of paint. That's sort of just a little bit of the paint sort of ends up flooding into the paper, and I quite like that. It adds almost like a little shadow. So of course there are other different shapes of trees. You may want to go for a more sort of UK landscape, in which case something like an oak tree might be really nice. So for an oak tree, I'm going to go and put a slightly wider trunk in first. And then from there, I'm sort of pulling out some of those sort of more fractured branches. So I'll put a few main branches in first. Just being really careful that your brush doesn't overlap too much when you're doing this. And again, they're not too uniformed, oak trees. And then you could grab a smaller brush, like a rigger brush. Of course, the trees are quite bare at the moment, which tells us it's a winter landscape, so that's quite important. So this is a little rigger brush, and it can be used to create some of the sort of thinner branches that we see coming off something like an oak tree. And we know with an oak tree that it's a fractal pattern. So each time it splits, it'll split again and again and again. I know some of you asked me about trees for this season, so this is for you if you asked me. And just sort of building up that beautiful pattern just by splitting and splitting and splitting. And these little rigger brushes, or liner brushes as they're known, are just really great for this more delicate work. Okay? So just keeping on splitting and splitting. You need those core chunky trunks, chunky areas of the trunk, and then just splitting and splitting and splitting to create a lovely sort of oak tree silhouette. And just lastly, you may find, I don't know, things like birch or hazel or things like that. Then you're aiming for maybe just like one trunk in the middle. And this is where something like your rigger brush or just the very tip of a slightly smaller brush might come in handy. Sort of pulling those branches upwards from the base and allowing them to split and overlap, but sort of reaching upwards. So a few different styles of winter tree that you might like to add to your winter landscape. And these would be sort of mid-ground to sort of background trees, I suppose, but just those lovely little silhouettes. Now, if we're looking at masses of trees that are really, really far away, then really all we want is sort of a section like this. And I'm just wetting down the paper, depending on what kind of trees. I'm thinking about sort of pine or fir trees now, sort of the ones that we see sitting at the base of the mountains, and some of these pictures that we're looking at of these wintry hillscapes. So I put that down first, allow it to sort of soften into the page a little bit. You don't want it pooling here, we don't want it too wet. And I'm going to get some of my paint, quite thick this time, point my brush upwards and start to add some shape. So the paint is going to move and soften quite a lot here, and that's okay, that's what we want. And as we work, it'll sort of gradually dry. So just putting down that base first, allowing the pigment to fill that space. So a sort of block or a line of trees, like I said, that you might see at the base of a mountain. And depending what trees, sort of adjusting how we do this. But I'm thinking about those pine or fir trees. And again, I'm getting some thicker paint now and just pointing out, and gradually as the paper starts to dry, that paint will stop moving as much. And so we're layering up that thicker paint, starting to get that sense of depth. And just allowing this to be what it is, which is what the eye would be able to see, rather than sort of going into too much detail here. And just keeping on, waiting for things to dry, and then adding in those little points sort of unevenly, some of them a little bit higher up, some of them a little bit lower, and getting that sense of sort of a block of trees, or sort of a foresty area, I suppose. So just even as I'm talking, the paint is drying, or the water's drying on the page, and that paint is moving a little bit less, and we're starting to get some sense of structure in our little chunk of trees. Yeah, you can even point out beyond a little bit the wet areas, and then you'll end up with some more defined points sort of sticking out. But it's just about layering and building up here, and letting these trees be tree-like. And you can sort of add the odd little trunk sticking out the bottom. It can be quite fun. And just that sense of trees far off in the distance, or sort of block of woodland, I suppose. And if you're looking at something that's more oak-like, for example, instead of those points, you'd just be sort of making things a little bit more rounded, I suppose. But this feels good for like a winter landscape, this sort of block of trees. So there we go, we're just going to let that one dry now, okay? Okay, so just one last thing to add on these trees. You can see these have actually dried quite nicely, and that's all we really need, is that level of looseness. So I just want to talk about trees that are much more in the foreground, or how we get that sense of one tree behind the other. So to begin with, I'm just going to do another pine tree, but with a really watered down version of my Payne's blue-grey. So I'll pop them in here a little bit bigger, and then just begin to add some of those lovely loose marks, just working with the tip of my brush again, starting to find that shape. And just working my way down, trying to keep things nice and loose. So essentially, anything which is closer to you needs to be darker, and as things move away, they become lighter. Because there's less light, essentially, as we get further away from a subject. So this is the concept of this, really. So if you paint in a sort of lighter tone, that will give the illusion of something sitting a little bit further back. So just building up that first little piney tree. And then maybe just grounding a little bit. So for the sort of snowy areas, you just need a sort of shadowy tone. And if you pull your brush sort of sideways like this, doing a bit of dry brushing can be a really nice way of just sort of showing where there's a sort of shift in the tone of the landscape. Just thought I'd just chuck that in. And some sense of sort of things being a little bit less flat. So dry brushing is really great for sort of snowy scapes. So this next tree, I'm just going to go a little bit thicker. And again, all trees are not the same, so try and keep a bit of variation in your trees here. A little bit thicker. I'm just going to pop it down just right alongside. Not my straightest tree to date, but that's okay. And I'm just going to do exactly the same thing, but just with much thicker paint here. And again, really allowing that white of the page to show through here. So we may not get all the way to the end of a landscape here today, but I think for the next couple of cycles, we're going to focus on landscape elements. And then in the last cycle, we'll start to bring that together into one whole sort of dear mother story. So just allowing those trees to sort of overlap a little bit as I paint them, working with slightly thicker paint here, keeping my brush strokes nice and loose. And I'm just going for a sort of more traditional tree. And that just gives the illusion of the snow as well when we've got those sort of gaps in between. So just remember not to be too tidy and even with these trees. Allow them to be sort of a bit loose and messy and not perfectly perfect, if that makes sense. And bring this one all the way down. So there we get that sense of sort of one tree in the distance, a little bit further away in the fog, versus one tree that's sort of sitting more in the foreground. We get that sense of depth again, okay? So just another little technique with trees that I thought you might quite enjoy there. Okay, my love, so I'm aware that sort of covering landscapes in one cycle is quite a big ask. But I think if we keep some boundaries in place, we keep it simple, we just work with the elements that we've explored so far during the cycle, so it'd be really nice to bring them together into some kind of composition, some kind of cold winter landscape. So I'm going to recommend that you work with either Payne's Grey or the Payne's Blue Grey if you've got any left in your palette. So Payne's Blue Grey being that one on the left-hand side. So it's got a cold tone anyway, which works, I think, really well for these cold winter landscapes. And I'm working on just some 300 GSM cold press, but it's a little bit textured, my paper today. It doesn't matter what paper you use, but I do recommend experimenting a little bit. Unfortunately, the paints don't behave quite as well on sort of this sort of student grade paper as they would do on something like a cotton rag base. But again, that's something you can experiment with and play with at home, but just work with what you've got for now, okay? So this one's a little bit textured, but it doesn't really matter what you use. And I've got some Payne's Blue Grey on my palette. There's also a bit of Moon Glow and some Shadow Violet, which I may use, but essentially I'm just trying to stick to some quite close boundaries here and create a study using some of the elements that we've explored so far in the tutorial. So I've got just some clean water here. That's just for putting down water for wet on wet. And then I've got another little pot just to rinse my brush, and I'm just working with a size 6 brush for this. So we need to get the mountain in first. And in order to do that, I'm going to put down some water. My brush is not very clean, so you can actually see what I'm doing, which is probably quite useful. I'm going to put down some water just to sort of find that sort of craggy shape of the mountain. I'm just trying not to make it too even. I was conscious not to create pyramids, which is easily done actually, I think, with a mountainscape. And just following that ridge line along, just putting a bit of water down so that when we start to add our paint, it's got somewhere to go. But leaving some gaps as well so that we get that sense of the snow poking through. Maybe your mountain could be a little bit darker at the base because it tends to have a bit more of a build-up of trees, etc. So that's there and in. If I've put down a bit too much water, especially at the top, I'm just going to take it out because I want to make sure that that peak is actually quite light. So a bit of push and pull here, and you can do this at a later stage as well. But give it a little bit of time for that water to sink into the paper because that will help your paint to move a little bit better. So we can see there just a really sort of light outline. I'm going straight into the Payne's Blue Grey now. So I'm going to get going a little bit and then start to drop it in to the mountainside. There we go. So in that goes. So this is wet on wet because we're making quite a soft mountain that's quite far off in the background, in the distance. So I wanted there to be a softness so that it sort of sits nicely behind the scene rather than sort of being too dominant, too textured. So just putting in some of that paint now, letting it split and flow and go where it wants to really, not overly controlling that, just dropping it in and seeing where it wants to go. And we can always adjust and change things as we go along if we're not happy with them. So sort of just seeing what happens as we add the paint here. It's moving really nicely on this paper. I don't really know. It just seems to be catching the paint really nicely, which is good. So interesting. It's always interesting to try out different types of paper and see how they perform for these things. But again, as long as you've got cold pressed paper, that tends to work really well for most wet on wet processes. I've got a sort of really big white gap here, so I'm just going to cut into that a little bit. It's a little bit too strong. And just sort of doing this intuitively, like putting a little bit down, having a look, seeing if it looks natural. If not, adding a little bit more. And it's starting to find its structure now, this mountain, or this background mountain. I suppose it's sort of, if you think about where you're trying to tell the story of the dear mother from, and that will depend what kind of landscape, but I really did have in my mind that we would cover some mountains, them being the sort of bones of the earth during this cycle. So they were in my mind's eye, in my imagination, so I hope they suit, or they fit with what you had in your mind's eye too. And if not, that's okay. There we go. I think that's probably enough for that mountain. I don't want to build it up too much or give it too much texture, because, like I said, I want it to sit softly in the background of this little sort of landscape story that we're building up. So that just needs to dry all the way down now, and then we'll be able to add the next layer. So go make a cuppa, or just, give yourself a little bit of drying time before you attempt the next stage. And don't forget, if there are areas where you've gone a bit too dark, you can just lift out like we did in the previous part of the cycle. So just a bit of fun here, really, playing with these landscapes of imagination. All right, so let's just let that dry, stop fiddling with it now. And I'll be back as soon as that's dry for the next part. Okay, so you can see my paper's a little bit buckled, so it's not quite dry yet, but I did just want to add in just a few trees at the base of this mountain, so I think I can get away with doing that now. It's just damp there, so if I added just a tiny bit more water, I don't want to add too much here, and just go straight in with my Payne's Blue Grey. Just wanted to add just a little tree line like we did in the tutorial earlier on. So just dabbing in those trees. And we can sort of add more little points to those trees once this gets a little bit drier, but we can just get a sense of sort of a little lining of trees at the base of the mountain. I think that'd be really, really nice. So just a little soft sense of a little forest at the base of the hills. And then maybe just adding a little bit more water, softening that off at the base and just pulling it across the paper. I've got quite a textured paper here, so it's giving me a little bit more of an effect on my dry brush, which is quite nice. But just that sense of something sitting not too orderly away at the base of that mountain. And actually, this area here is probably dry enough for me to start to add some trees, and I want them to sort of sit about here and overlap onto the mountain a little bit, so we can use that technique that we used earlier on in the cycle to just pop in some trees. I think I'll start with a slightly lighter one in the background, and I'm going to put that in the middle around here. So coming in just over halfway down the page. Just working with a slightly lighter tone on this one, because this one's going to sit a little bit further back, and just laying that over the top of that soft mountain. So the darker I go with my paints, the more that paint's going to sit in the foreground, or the more that tree is going to sit in the foreground even. So just slowly but surely working my way down, keeping my brush strokes nice and uneven really. Trying to keep a bit of that sense of the sort of looseness of the tree, maybe with a little bit of snow poking through. And just sort of laying that over the top. Lovely. And then maybe we'll just ground that tree a little bit with a bit of water, just to sort of create a new layer, a new space. So sort of everything in between becomes snow. And maybe some little marks as well there, just some sense of some shadows. So I think it needs at least maybe one more tree here, maybe even another one up here that's a little bit taller. So I'll put those in, but I'll speed that up a little bit for you. And then I definitely want something sitting here as well, but I'm just waiting for that area to dry. So slightly thicker paint now. And just popping in a slightly heavier, darker tree in the foreground. Just working a little bit on my forest as well whilst I'm at it, just to make it a little bit more pointy. And then I thought maybe just one more little tree in the foreground would be nice. Little groups of three, one or three are quite nice for composition. And just grounding that in, adding a little bit of water. So I'm going to add one more tree on the right hand side. Still a little bit damp, so it's a bit risky, but I'm just going to go for it. And it's okay if a little bit of it softens into the background. There we go, so just a few more little marks just to add shadow, add a sense of depth. So this little mini landscape experiment, and then I'll come back and we'll look at the third part. Okay. Okay, so I don't know if you can see, but I've just sort of traced in or sort of sketched in a little outline for my deer here and sort of tried to position them in a sort of suitable place in that sort of bottom third of the landscape. And it is quite helpful to have an outline to work with here rather than working freehand. I did do one of this freehand and my deer looked like cows. Anyway, so I do recommend, I've left some images on the resources if you want to trace in or carbon paper in the outline, whatever you want to do there. And I wanted to make these into reindeer because this feels like a reindeer landscape. So I've used some images of reindeer so that I get the right sort of shape. And then just going back in with my Payne's Blue Grey, I'm just going to fill in that space. I'll just get the shape or the sort of silhouette of the deer in. So I suppose just one more step forward from what we were doing with our cave painted deer here. Of course, you can make your deer a lot bigger than this. And sort of play around a little bit with the scale. So just carefully blocking in my deer here, using that little outline that I traced down to help me. And sort of adjusting where necessary. I'm painting on quite a small scale here, so it might have been helpful to have a smaller brush, like a size 4 or a size 2. And of course your deer can be a lot bigger than mine. You've got quite a large space there, so if you wanted to scale them up a little bit and get an even further sense of depth, then you could. So I decided to have one male and one female reindeer. So I'm just adding in those caribou antlers and then adding in some larger antlers just for my male deer. There we go. So my little deer are in the picture now, and then I just need something just to ground them as well. So I'm just going to add a little bit of paint just in the area that they're standing. And maybe soften that off a little bit with a bit of water. So it really is just a tonal study, this. Just a chance to sort of get a sense of a composition or a landscape. And with the cool tone just sort of showing sort of shadows, the light and shadows in the snow, I suppose. So again, you can dry brush in this foreground a little bit. You're just pulling your brush across a little bit, adding a little bit of texture. And then maybe just some little grasses sitting in this foreground, sort of poking out. And just to give that sense of something a little bit more nearby. So just a little play with creating sort of the illusion of depth, is working with that white blank space, popping in some little deer silhouettes, just to get a sense of our deer in the landscape. Doesn't have to be perfect at this stage. We're still just playing with those landscape elements, but I hope you enjoy this little play with sort of pulling together some of the stuff that we learned during the tutorial about how to create a winter landscape. And there are loads of different versions that we could do here. Like I said, perhaps in the end we'll have some sort of landscapes that move from wintery into spring. I'm not sure really. It's such an open-ended project in terms of how we pull it together at the end. I wouldn't worry about that too much for now, but just have a little play with starting to visualise the landscape that our reindeer especially might inhabit, as we think about sort of incorporating a little bit of the reindeer world into our studies, and not just the deer themselves, but the spaces that they graze and occupy. So just a little landscape of the imagination, really, out of my imagination, and sending that towards yours. Okay.